You checked your account on the 10th of last month and stared at that number for about 3 seconds without understanding what had happened. The paycheck had hit on the 1st. 10 days. 10 days and it was already half gone. No trip, no big purchase, nothing that explains that hole. And yet there it was, the balance smaller than it should be, staring back at you with the indifference of numbers that don't lie. Marcus went through that every single month for 3 years. 32 years old, systems analyst for a federal agency, take-home pay of $5,400 a month. That's not nothing. Most people in this country don't get close to that. And still, every time someone asked how his finances were doing, he gave that same answer, getting by, with a smile that covered the embarrassment of not understanding where the money kept going. It wasn't a knowledge problem. Marcus had a spreadsheet. He had a budgeting app. He'd read 2 books on personal finance. He understood compound interest, knew the difference between assets and liabilities, knew he should be saving at least 20% every month. He knew all of it and couldn't do any of it. Because Marcus's problem wasn't mathematical. It was something else, something deeper, quieter, harder to name. Something most finance books can't show you because they were written to teach technique, and Marcus's problem, and probably yours too, isn't technical. It's psychological, it's behavioral, it's emotional. And if you're here right now, with that familiar discomfort of someone who makes a decent salary and still feels like money slips through their fingers, then what I have to show you might be the most important thing you hear about money in the next few years. Because the money that disappears doesn't disappear by accident. It goes somewhere. It always goes somewhere. And when you find out where, not in the numbers but in the mind, that's when things start to change. I'll show you exactly how that works. But first, I need you to understand something about how the human mind handles financial stability. Something most people have never stopped to look at directly. Daniel Kahneman, one of the most important psychologists of the last century, spent decades studying how people make decisions. What he found was unsettling. Most of our decisions aren't made by the rational side of the mind. They're made by the emotional side, fast, automatic, driven by feelings, not logic. He called it System 1, the mind's autopilot. System 1 doesn't calculate, it reacts. It seeks immediate pleasure, avoids discomfort, and builds narratives that make emotional sense, even when they make no mathematical sense. And when it comes to money, System 1 does something very specific in the stable worker. It builds an equilibrium, not financial, emotional. Marcus brought home $5,400 a month, but Marcus also woke up every Monday knowing he couldn't miss a day, that there was a 9 a.m. meeting, that he had a report due by Friday, that his supervisor was in a bad mood, that the guy in the next cubicle talked too much, that the office AC had been broken for 2 weeks. Marcus had pressure, he had responsibility, he had an invisible energy cost, mental, emotional, sometimes physical, that he paid every single day to maintain that stability. And Marcus's System 1 understood that very well. It understood that pressure needed a release valve, that the tension accumulated during the week needed somewhere to go, and it found the most efficient place in the world for that. Money! Not consciously, not deliberately. Marcus didn't wake up on Friday thinking, I'm going to spend money to compensate for the week's stress. But the behavior was there, the lunch that cost more than planned, the delivery order that wasn't necessary, the impulse purchase on his lunch break, the subscription he'd forgotten about but never cancelled, because cancelling required energy, and energy was what he didn't have. None of those individual expenses were large. $30 here, $50 there, a monthly charge that hit the card on autopilot, but added together across 30 days, they built the exact hole that appeared on the statement on day 10. There's a name for this. Not the name finance books use, not a technical market term. I call it the invisible emotional drain. The invisible emotional drain is the collection of financial outflows the mind creates to balance the emotional cost of stability. The higher the emotional cost of the work, the bigger the drain. And the cruelest part of that equation is that it's circular. You work harder to earn more, you earn more. The stress increases, the drain increases proportionally, and you end the month with the same balance as before, unable to figure out what happened. Marcus did exactly that for 3 years. Every raise he received was absorbed by the drain before he could notice it. Not because he was irresponsible, not because he didn't know what he was doing, but because the mechanism was working exactly as designed by the mind to maintain emotional equilibrium, not to build wealth. And here's the cruel paradox that most people never look at directly. The more financially stable you are, the harder it is to notice that you're standing still. The person drowning in debt knows something is wrong. The pain is sharp, visible, impossible to ignore. They're forced to act. The stable worker, the one who pays the bills, has the secure job, doesn't owe anyone, never gets that shock. They're comfortable enough not to need to change, and comfortable enough to never build anything beyond comfortable. That's the comfort of financial mediocrity, not poverty, not wealth. The middle ground that feels safe and is, in reality, the most sophisticated trap that exists. Marcus was there, chances are you are too. The question isn't whether the drain exists. It exists, in varying degrees, in nearly every stable salary worker I've ever talked to about this. The question is knowing where yours is operating. Because everyone's drain is different. It takes the shape of your specific release valves, your consumption patterns, your narratives about what you deserve after a hard week. And to identify yours, you need something no spreadsheet can give you. You need to understand the real emotional cost of your work. Not the salary, the cost. How many hours do you spend in environments that drain your energy? How many meetings are actually necessary, and how many exist only because the company culture demands presence? What's the first thing you do when you get home on a Thursday night after a heavy week? You don't have to answer now, but hold on to that question. Because the answer has everything to do with where your money goes when it disappears. Before we continue, I need to show you something I built after understanding exactly what we're talking about here. It's called the Free Your Mind Kit, 3 tools that work together. The ebook has 35 pages of real financial psychological diagnosis. It's not a savings tip, it's a map of the invisible patterns that trap men with stable salaries. The Cost of Stability Calculator is an interactive tool. You enter your numbers and it shows you the real cost of not acting, in wealth, in time, in deferred freedom. And the Free Your Mind series is 3 audio tracks of 7 to 12 minutes, made to listen to when you wake up or before you sleep, working on identity, value, and action where knowledge alone can't reach. The 3 complement each other. The ebook creates intellectual awareness, the calculator creates emotional awareness, the audios work on identity. It's not a course, no subscription, lifetime access, everything for under $7. The link is in the description. When you're ready. Back to what we were saying. Marcus arrived at this understanding by accident, not through a book, not through a video, not through a spreadsheet. It was during a conversation with his father. Marcus's father had retired after 35 years as a supervisor at a county agency, the kind of stability Marcus was also building toward. And on a random Sunday afternoon, his father said something that stuck with Marcus for weeks. He said, "The only thing that job gave me was time I'll never get back. The money, I never saw it. It came in, it went out, and when I looked back, it was all just gone." Marcus went quiet because he recognized the pattern, the exact same pattern, 35 years in front of him like a mirror of what had been happening for the past 3. And then he did something simple. He didn't create a new spreadsheet. He didn't download a different app. He didn't read another book. He sat in silence for an entire afternoon and tried to answer one single question. What exactly happens in the first 72 hours after my paycheck hits? Not the transactions, the emotional states. What was he feeling when he bought that more expensive lunch on Monday? What was he thinking when he agreed to go out on Wednesday, even though he was exhausted? What was the internal narrative that accompanied each unplanned expense. It was hours of discomfort, because looking at those patterns directly is like looking at a version of yourself that you'd rather not know. But that afternoon was when Marcus found the drain. Not one drain, three. The first was what he called the Monday compensation. Every start of the week, the first expense of the day was a little more than necessary. A specialty coffee, a nicer lunch, a small unnecessary purchase. It was as if the mind needed a gift at the start of the week to accept what was coming. The second was what I call the ghost subscription. Marcus had 8 active subscriptions. He used 3. The other 5 existed because cancelling required time and decision-making, and in a low-energy state, the mind prefers to maintain the status quo rather than spend cognitive effort on something that would only save a few dollars. The third was the most subtle and the most expensive. Researcher Kathleen Vose published a study known as ego depletion, the idea that the capacity to make good decisions is finite, and when you spend that capacity at work, there's less left for financial decisions. Marcus spent most of his decision-making energy on meetings, reports, team conflicts. By evening, the financial no was too weak to function. Morgan Housel, in his book on the psychology of money, has an idea that goes straight to the point. The biggest obstacle to healthy financial behavior isn't lack of knowledge. It's that human life is long and confusing enough that good intentions are constantly interrupted by good justifications. Marcus had all the good intentions and a collection of very good justifications. I worked hard this week, I deserve it. It's just this once. The amount is small, it won't make a difference. I'll make up for it next month. Each justification true in some sense. Each justification completely compatible with a pattern that, summed up, drained years of financial potential without leaving a visible trace. But there's something most people do at that moment, when they recognize the pattern, when they understand where the drain comes from, when they finally connect the dots between the emotional cost of work and financial behavior. What most people do is create a rule. Starting now, I won't spend on delivery. Starting now, I'll cancel the subscriptions I don't use. Starting now, I'll save 30% of my paycheck. And it works for 2, 3, 4 weeks, and then it stops. Because a rule without an identity structure is just willpower, and willpower is finite. The problem isn't the rule. The problem is that the rule was built on the same foundation that created the drain, the foundation of conscious effort. And the drain operates in the unconscious. You cannot defeat the unconscious with conscious effort indefinitely. What Marcus understood, and what takes the longest to arrive because it sounds too simple to be true, is that the only way to dry up the drain is to change the internal narrative about what money represents. As long as money is reward for the suffering of work, it will be spent as reward for the suffering of work. It's a psychological equation. It's automatic. No spreadsheet wins against that. Marcus spent 3 months doing something different from rules. He started associating money saved with freedom of time, not deprivation of pleasure. Every dollar that stayed in the account wasn't a dollar he was denying himself. It was one more hour of control over his own time at some future point. It was a different question. Not, can I afford this, but what does this money buy me in terms of options? The change was slow. It wasn't linear. There were good months and bad months, but at 6 months, for the first time in 3 years, the statement on day 10 had a number that didn't embarrass him. Not because he'd denied himself something, but because the internal relationship with money had changed function. It was no longer reward, it was a tool. Now I want to talk about resistance, because if you've arrived here with some skepticism, with that internal voice saying your situation is different, that this works for others but not for you specifically, I want to name that before you close this window. My salary is too low to apply any of this. Marcus made $5,400 a month. I know people who made this transformation on $2,200. The principle doesn't change with the amount. The psychological mechanism is the same. What changes is the scale. I have a family, kids, debt. The situation is different. Real obligations exist and need to be respected. But the invisible emotional drain operates on top of what's left after the obligations, even in people with debt. Especially in people with debt, because financial pressure increases the emotional cost, which increases the drain. I've tried to change and can't. That's the most honest one. And the honest answer to it is, you tried to change the behavior without changing the psychological structure that generates the behavior. That's like bailing out a boat with a cup while the hole is still there. It's not weakness, it's the wrong strategy. Marcus's turning point wasn't when he created the rule. It was when he stopped fighting the drain and started understanding why it existed. There's an enormous difference between money disappears and I make money go away for reasons I now understand. The second sentence has a subject. It has agency. It has a point of intervention. The first sentence is powerlessness. The second is the beginning of a process. Marcus today isn't wealthy. This isn't the story of someone who became a millionaire in 2 years or who found a magic formula. Marcus today has a 6-month emergency fund, has a reserve that grows every month slowly, without drama, has a relationship with his own money that he describes with one word he hadn't used in 3 years. Clarity. Not relief, not pride, clarity. And when you have clarity about what's happening with your money, not the clarity of numbers, but the clarity of the psychological patterns that move the numbers, you have something no spreadsheet can give you. You have real control. Not control over the salary, not control over inflation, not control over the market, control over the internal relationship with what you have. And that control, compounded over time, is exactly what separates those who accumulate from those who don't, regardless of how much they earn. Marcus understood this at 35. The sooner you understand it, the more time you have to work with it in your favor. If something I said today made sense, if you recognized a pattern, if something named what you knew but couldn't articulate, tell me in the comments with one word. What was the moment you realized the problem wasn't technical? And if you haven't subscribed to Mind of Value yet, do it now. Not for the finance tips, there are 1,000 channels for that, but for a different proposition, a new way of thinking about the relationship between mind and money, a way that doesn't promise fast wealth because fast wealth doesn't exist. It promises real understanding, and real understanding, applied with consistency, is the only path that lasts. You're already here. That's already a start.